webinar will be recorded so that we can share it with others who aren't able to attend this event live. We're very glad to have you with us this morning. I'm going to hand over to the presenters in just a minute, but in the meantime, I wanted to just ask you a few housekeeping items. Just to cut down on background noise, we would ask you to keep your line muted as much as possible throughout the webinar. At the end, there will be a chance for some question and answers, and you can unmute your line at that point. Throughout the webinar, however, you can type questions either in the chat window. You can type the questions directly to everyone, or you can type them to INEE on WebEx. That's the account through which I'm accessing the webinar, and I'll be happy to relay your questions to the presenters at the end of the webinar. Look for follow-up from this webinar with the recording and other presentations on the INEE website when we're all done. So that's it. With that, I'm very pleased to hand over the webinar to Charlotte Bergen, who's the Education and Emergencies Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Save the Children UK, and she's going to take us through the rest of the webinar with a team, a crackpot team of presenters who are going to show us how the Teachers in Crisis Context Training Pack has been used in a variety of contexts. So again, welcome. Keep your lines muted and enjoy the webinar. Over, you should be able to click on the presentation now and take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. And just a huge thanks to INEE and to Peter, who has to get up very early to make all of this happen. So a huge thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us today, despite a few technical difficulties. I'm really grateful that you're able to join us. So this is a Teacher Professional Development in Action webinar, really looking at using the Teachers in Crisis Context Training Pack in the field. So the objectives to today are really around coming together to share experiences of implementing and contextualizing the training pack in a range of settings, outlining some guidelines and lessons learned for future use of training, and then sharing some next steps for the Teachers in Crisis Context group, which we've started to refer to as the TIC, so if we say TIC, apologies, and some future open source materials that will be available soon. And perhaps just to do some introductions, as Peter mentioned, I'm Charlotte from Save the Children UK, and I am also one of the co-chairs of the Teachers in Crisis Context reference group, and I've been fortunate to be working on this as part of this group over the last couple of years now as part of the design process back in 2015 and recent piloting implementation. So it's really exciting to be doing the webinar today. I'm joined by two amazing panelists, so thank you both for joining us. So we have Kathleen Denny joining us from NRC out in Iraq, and like me, Kathleen was part of that initial design process and has a real range of experience using the materials, and we'll be talking about her experiences using them in Iraq with IRC, and then also her work she's been doing, exciting interagency work with NRC in South Sudan. And we're also joined by Danielle Fort, who has pretty much just got off the plane back from Kenya, so thank you for joining us, Danny. And Danny is part of Mary Mendenhall's team at Teachers College, Columbia University, and she's been working, really leading the implementation of the exciting Teachers for Teachers initiative that's happening in Kenya at the moment. So look forward to hearing more from them shortly. What we're going to do is I'm going to just give a brief overview of the materials. I'm conscious that many on the line are very familiar with them, so we won't spend too long on that. And just an overview of key guiding principles, really, for implementation and contextualization. I'll then hand over so we can hear from our fantastic panelists about their really concrete practical experiences of how they're using the materials and the lessons they've learned. And then really we want to hand over to all of you, both to answer questions, but also to hear about your experiences. I'm conscious that many of you are using the materials in lots of exciting ways, and we're keen to learn as much as we can. So really quick background to the TIC, the Teachers in Crisis Context group. This was formed by a group of EIE colleagues coming together a few years ago now, really recognizing the serious challenges facing teachers in crisis settings, both in terms of the challenging teaching environment, but also the very limited support available to these teachers. And so this group came together. It was an interagency effort to really identify problem areas in teacher management and development in crisis contexts, and to propose and provide open source solutions. And the big first initiative and first output was creating this open source set of materials that would be available and have been available on the website since the spring of 2016. And so this again was recognizing the real lack of kind of comprehensive quality materials available. Just for information, hopefully you're all already aware, but you can find the materials on the INEE website, on the TPD page, and on the training pack landing page. Please do note that Arabic and French versions are coming very soon. They're just being finalized, and they will be available shortly, and we look forward to sharing those with you. And if you ever do have any questions about the materials, please do reach out to us. You can see there the address, and as Peter said, the slides will be shared, so you can have all of this information, but tpd@ineesite.org, and we'd be happy to help. So just to give you a little bit of information about how the training was developed. This was, as I mentioned, a unique 18-month collaboration to develop the materials. The curriculum design taking place at the team at Teachers College, Columbia University, in close collaboration with senior EIE advisors from a range of organizations on the working group. Then it was field tested in several locations and went through an extensive external review process as well to produce the materials that are available today. I think it's also worth noting this is a competency-based training, and that's really important to the working group, and was indeed the first step was a competency framework, which hopefully you can find is available to everyone on the INEE website, and hopefully you've seen that. Just to give you a overview, you can see the competency wheel to the side there. You can, as you see, this key competency areas are around teacher role and well-being, child protection, well-being and inclusion, pedagogy, curriculum and planning, and subject knowledge. Just to note, the materials address the first 4 of those. Subject knowledge isn't featured in the pack, but we recognize that it's a key competency area, but that as it's so context specific, the materials don't address that area. And that's something we're conscious of and continue to think about how best support. In terms of the approach, the materials, hopefully you can see that they're drawing on a lot of research, existing good practice and great materials there. And the approach is meant to be one that's very flexible and adaptable to the different contexts and needs. It's very low resource and low tech, gender and conflict sensitive at all times. It's a very participatory and interactive approach, so very much focusing on modeling and also creating as much practice time as possible within the training for teachers to try out new strategies. And there's a real focus on well-being and collaboration. And the other key thing to say is that contextualization is key, and our panelists are going to speak to that shortly, but there is guidance throughout the materials. Obviously, you know, we really wanted to create a really strong and useful global resource, but we know it's only going to be really relevant and useful if it is appropriate for the context. So lots of guidance around contextualization. Quickly then, in terms of what is training, the idea is that this pack can be used in any way that you would like it. So, getting a lot of background noise. If you could mute, that would be amazing. So you can pick up and use particular sessions or modules, or you can use the whole pack in your training approach, whatever is best for your approach. But just so you know what's available, there is introductory guidance on the website. There is also an introductory training pack. This is a fast-track introduction to the key concepts and competencies, and we really thought of it as a pre-service introduction for new teachers or when time is very constrained in the context. There are 12 sessions, around 23 hours of instruction, and most colleagues have used this as a 4-day training using a day for each of the key areas, so a day for teacher role, a day for child protection, and so on. But then there's also the extended training pack, and this was really recognizing that we really need to try and move away from a workshop model of training and provide more sustained support. So these are core modules intended to be used for continuous development over an extended period of time, which has really ranged. Colleagues have used them over a month to over a year, so that really again depends on the context and the needs. 18 sessions, around 16 hours of instruction. And so people have really focused sort of maybe done 3 days on one module, then the teachers have gone away to implement and try things out, and then after a month or so come back together for the next module. But it really depends on the particular context. So those are sort of the materials available. There is a detailed facilitator's guide for each of the modules, alongside a participant's handbook, and you can find all of those resources on the INEE website, as I mentioned. We can provide a lot more detail about the contents of sessions and different modules and the different competencies. I haven't included it here for time, as I know you're often familiar with the materials, but we can answer questions about that perhaps at the end. So what I'd like to just quickly do before handing over to Kathleen and Danny is to really talk about kind of the broad implementation and contextualization principles, kind of the key steps that we would identify as being important for this process. And then we'll look at the practical examples through the panelists. So firstly then, prioritising assessing teacher needs as kind of a key first step in this process. And obviously, as you're all doing all the time, these different ways of assessing those needs, from the lit reviews and M&E data available, the kind of key informant interviews and focus group discussions with a whole host of colleagues, whether it's the Ministry of Education and Training Colleges, the students, teachers, the parents, NGO partners, but talking to as many people as possible. Teachers assessment, both in terms of spending time in classrooms with teachers and potentially pre-testing as well, and student assessment, all kinds of options. But what we'd really recommend is kind of the key principle is really listening to the teachers. And that was something that we found really important in the design process and really powerful in the implementation process as well. So that would, I think we'd really want to emphasize that as key. The second key area that we'd point to is this issue of contextualizing the material. So as I said, there's a lot of guidance in the materials about how to do this, but we really would recommend spending time getting to know the materials and adapting them to the context. And so key things that we point to in the guidance is around making sure cultural norms and references are relevant and appropriate for the teachers and students, and that specific issues and concerns are relating to the crisis context. We also really recommend, of course, having the relevant local legal and policy frameworks and curriculum available and knowledge of those. And then you'll also see throughout the training where we suggest inviting local experts to provide input or present relevant sessions that may be needed. So, for example, on child protection mechanisms or on psychosocial support. So that contextualization piece being really key for us when we think about implementation. The third area is perhaps the most obvious, planning the training, but given all of the needs assessment and the contextualization process, then really thinking about the time frame. As I said, this training is meant to be as sort of useful and usable as possible, so deciding what time frame works best for you and for your participants and facilitators, and also the sequencing. It's designed to work in with the order that you see as most appropriate for your use. And lastly, logistics, practical things around who the facilitators are, who the participants might be, the timings, locations, and so on. And our panelists can speak to some of that as well. The next thing which we really prioritize and would really stress around implementation would be providing ongoing support for TPD, really recognizing that while it's so important, of course, to have a really kind of strong quality training for teachers, that actually to really support development, we need to be providing more sustained support in the classroom. And so really thinking about ways to do that. And we'll mention later on some materials that the TIC are designing to support those efforts, but things to consider around the needs, the number and location of teachers, the budget and staff capacity, and then, of course, the appropriate approach, whether that's face-to-face training, teacher learning circles, mentoring, coaching, and so on. And just worth saying that the approach of the materials is very much to foster this peer collaboration as well. So that's something that, again, Kathleen and Danny will be able to speak to. And then very lastly, thinking about developing the M&E framework appropriate for your context. We point to some examples in the guidance we give around pre and post test for the training, classroom observations, mentoring forms, feedback assessment, and so on. But also just to note that this is a big stream of work for the TIC this year, and so the team are putting together a theory of change and different tools for that. So we look forward to updating on that. But in the meantime, that guidance is available in the in the introductory guidance on the website. So that's a bit of a whirlwind of what the materials are and our principles for implementation, but I'd really like to hand over to our panelists to talk about their really concrete experiences and examples in a number of settings. As I say, people really are using those materials in different ways. So I'm going to hand over to Kathleen now, and she's going to start talking about Iraq. So I'll hand over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks. Okay. So as she's switching over power to operate the PowerPoint, just to reintroduce myself, my name is Kathleen Dindy, and I'm currently the Education Project Manager for NRC in Dahuk, Iraq. Previously, I was on the curriculum development team for the TIC materials with Charlotte at Teachers College, and then I worked with the IRC here in Iraq to pilot the materials and contextualize them for the Kurdish region. And then this last year, I worked with NRC and an interagency group in South Sudan to contextualize the materials there as well. So I'm first going to start off by talking about Iraq, and then Danny will talk about Kakuma in Kenya, and then I'll come back at the end and talk about South Sudan. Just to start off with Iraq, a brief overview of the context. There are two different conflict-affected populations in Iraq that we're working with. First are conflict-affected Iraqis. The recent conflict with ISIS started in 2014, and that caused massive displacement across Iraq. A lot of IDPs have moved into the Kurdish region, which is the green area on the map. IDPs live in urban areas and in camp settings. There are also Syrian refugees who started to come to Iraq in 2011 and 2012. Most of those refugees are Kurdish, and so they've also moved into the Kurdish region of Iraq. There are also IDPs in the south around Baghdad and Fallujah, but for my work with IRC, I focus mostly on the Kurdish region in the north. So once again, that's the green area on the map. This map really quickly shows you each of the IDP and refugee camps in the northern areas. So the green is IDP and the blue is refugee. So this was 2015, and then starting last October, the Iraqi security forces started to retake Mosul from ISIS, and so that caused further displacement. So this map here shows the IDP camps that have popped up in 2016 and 2017 as a result of the Mosul response. So different challenges that teachers face in Iraq include a lack of learning spaces. A lot of the schools were either destroyed or occupied during the conflict. Another one is lack of salaries or incentives. The Directorate of Education in Nineveh, which is Mosul, and then Dahuk. In all of the Kurdish region, most of the DOEs are lacking money to pay teachers. There are limited resources, overage learners who have missed school for 2 or more years. Language of instruction varies between Arabic and Kurdish. There's a shortage of printed curriculum. Issues of social cohesion between each of the different groups. We have Kurds, Christians, Yazidis, Muslims, Sunni, Shia, etc. And then also, obviously, students have dealt with trauma, and teachers also have their own personal trauma to deal with. So when I first got to Iraq in 2015, my job was to pilot the TIC materials and then also contextualize the materials. So one of the first things I did was a literature review to better understand the context and to see what teacher training materials were being used already. Then I did a teacher focus group discussion with 5 different teachers from 10 schools in Domiz refugee camp. Domiz is the largest refugee camp in Iraq and the second largest in the Syria response region. And that's where we really focused the piloting phase of the TIC materials. We also did teacher interviews to get a little bit more personalized responses, classroom observations so we'd understand the different spaces that teachers were working with and the materials they had access to, how many kids were in the classroom. We could understand kind of the gender dynamics. And then after I did each of those things, I went back to the curriculum and I started to contextualize it, and I started to adapt it based on the realities of what I saw in the classroom and what I heard from the teachers. Once I had modified the training, then I piloted it with a group of 30 teacher trainers from the Teacher Training Institute of DeHook. And those teacher trainers sat in on the training, and then each day at the end of each module, they gave me feedback about what they thought would be helpful for teachers. They shared ideas. They gave me ideas about how to make it more relevant for teachers or realistic for their classrooms. And then after that process, I edited again, and then we sent it for translation. And so we were translating from English to Arabic, and that was quite the process. That was one of the big takeaways, was that you need a lot of time for translation because it can be technical, and you also need a review process, but I'll talk about that later. We also contacted different topical experts. For instance, there's a module about child protection, but we needed to know more specifics about referral mechanisms in the camp that we were working in. So we worked with child protection experts to add those details, and then at the end of all of that, we had our finalized contextualized version of the TIC materials for Kurdistan. So from there, with the IRC, we decided to target 300 formal school teachers that were both IDP and refugee teachers in camp and urban settings across the Kurdish region of Iraq, so in 3 different governorates. For the training, we used the introductory training pack in August before the school started, and then that was a 4-day training, and then we did a refresher training in December. We also provided ongoing support to teachers using teacher learning circles, which are professional learning communities that teachers met in once a month, and they would kind of review topics from the training that they needed refreshers on, or sometimes the teachers would bring up their own topics that they wanted more support in. And they did that once a month, and then we also had teacher mentoring. So our education officers did classroom observations twice a year, so each teacher was observed once a semester, and then after that observation, they were given feedback in like a 20-minute meeting. For this project with IRC, we had 1 officer to about 40 teachers. Some of our officers had limited background in teaching, so it was a little bit difficult for them to really come alongside teachers and give them practical feedback. So that was one of our areas that we needed improvement in. The staff required training in, obviously, the TIC training pack. They also needed to be trained on TLCs and mentoring, and also on how to conduct classroom observations and how to give feedback to teachers. So now, 2 years later, or I guess a year and a half later, the IRC is going to be using these materials again, and they have a 2-year project with GIZ to implement the training with 3,000 formal teachers, both IDP and refugee, across the DeHook governorate. So this is just one governorate of the Kurdish region. And what they're going to be doing is they are working with the Teacher Training Institute of DeHook. They're working with their teacher trainers, training them, and they will be using those teachers as the trainers and as the mentors, and to help facilitate teacher learning circles. So they'll do an introductory training in July for 5 days, a refresher training in July next year, since it's a 2-year program. And then, like I said, they'll have TLCs once a month and teacher classroom observations twice a semester. So this approach this time is obviously larger. It's expanding to more teachers, but it's also providing more technical support through more experienced mentors and trainers. So hopefully that should make a good impact on the outcomes of the training. But this is a good example of how to use the training in a larger way with more sustained follow-up for teachers. So different lessons learned from this process in Iraq. Ministry approval was a difficult topic for both rounds. When I was working originally in 2015, we had approval from the Ministry of Education at the national level or bill, but we faced issues with the Directorate of Education at the local level, and so they actually put a stop on our education programming, and so anyway, we had to be creative on how we were actually going to train teachers because of that. Something else we learned was that interagency coordination is really important. There were lots of different practices for training teachers in DeHook. The ministry, actually the DeHook DOE was requesting NGOs to pay their teacher trainers on top of their government salaries, and some NGOs were willing to do that and others weren't, and so that was causing some issues. There's also a lot of overlap in terms of teachers being trained twice by two different NGOs on similar topics, so coordination was something we needed to improve. And then also, I think this is important for all teacher training. It's really important to incorporate teachers into curriculum development as much as possible. That wasn't something that we were able to do too much of at the first round, but moving forward, that's something that we'd like to do. And then also translation and verification was an issue. So moving forward, next time I'd recommend giving more time for translation and also doing back translation and some kind of verification to make sure that the translation is accurate. So that's everything for Iraq. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Danny, if I'm able to find her.
Hi, everyone. So as I'm getting the power from Kathleen, first of all, thank you so much, Kathleen, for talking about all of the work with IRC in Iraq and the TICS materials, and Charlotte for inviting me to talk about Kenya and Teachers for Teachers. So I will briefly give an overview of the camp just to have some context and move on to some of the challenges teachers are facing in Kakuma, and speak a little bit to the 2015 pilot training and research that Charlotte mentioned earlier. I'll then go into our model, the Teachers for Teachers model, how we're using the training pack itself, key contextualization takeaways, and some limitations of our approach. Kakuma has been open for 26 years. It first opened in 1991. And the demographics are pretty diverse. The majority of refugees in Kakuma are from South Sudan, but it does host refugees from the DRC, Uganda, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Burundi, and recently, in the last several months, non-Somali refugees as well as Somali refugees going through resettlement from Dadaab are being relocated to Kakuma. So it's a pretty diverse population. And as you can see, there are a lot of school-aged youth, nearly 60,000, and this does not include the overage learners who are accessing school, but there are only 21 primary schools in the camp with less than 600 teachers, the majority of whom are refugees, and there's a very high attrition rate, partially due to the lack of professional development support that they receive. Only 31% of primary school teachers are trained, and that training can be as minimal as 1 day. Some of the challenges that teachers in Kakuma refugee camp face, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the challenges because I'm sure they're similar to the challenges teachers face in the context where you work. But I'm happy to talk in more detail about any specific challenge. For the purposes of time, though, I just want to flag the first one, this lack of pre-service and in-service training. And in Kakuma, that's really important to think about because many of the teachers arrived as young children in the camp. So they've had all of their schooling within Kakuma, primary and secondary school. And if not in the camp, then in Kenya, if they received a scholarship to attend a secondary school outside of Kakuma. And this is important because we know that professional development actually begins when teachers are students themselves and witnessing what their teachers are doing in the classroom. So when you think about what professional development needs these teachers might have, it's really helpful to know their own educational background. In 2015, Dr. Mary Mendenhall and Charlotte Bergen and Peter Bjorklund, another TC graduate, traveled to Kakuma to pilot the training, which is now the training for primary school teachers in crisis context. But they also conducted corresponding research on teacher identity and professional development. And this research took place over the month that they were there and was in the form of one-on-one interviews with teachers, as well as classroom observations. And this proved to be invaluable in terms of contextualizing the materials in that pilot training, as well as serving as a needs assessment for the Teachers for Teachers project. As Charlotte mentioned earlier, we know that effective teacher professional development models are sustained and ongoing, and there's a real push to move away from the one-off workshop model. But what was really interesting to hear from the teachers is that they recognized that that was the type of professional development they wanted also. It wasn't just based in research. The teachers in Kakuma throughout this pilot research continuously said that they wanted more ongoing support and more professional development opportunities in general, which led Dr. Mendenhall, with generous funding from IDEO.org, to create Teachers for Teachers in partnership with UNHCR, the Lutheran World Federation, LWF, who is the implementing partner for primary school education in Kakuma, and Finn Church Aid, FCA. So there are a lot of acronyms, so I'm sorry if I'm throwing out a bunch. But Teachers for Teachers really took into account the needs of the teachers, the needs that teachers in Kakuma were expressing through these one-on-one interviews, that they wanted ongoing integrated support. So we've combined in-person training, both of the extended training pack, so the 4 modules, and the introductory training pack, with peer coaching and mobile mentoring. And the peer coaching and the mobile mentoring really reinforce the learning that happened in the training and support teachers continue to develop the teacher competencies. So the peer coaching consists of teacher learning circles that meet once or twice a month. And it's facilitated by teachers who have also gone through the training and have been selected to go through an additional peer coach training, and classroom observations that happen around once a month or once every 2 months. The mobile mentoring connects teachers in Kakuma with global mentors outside of the camp, and they have a curriculum that has similar content to the TIC pack itself. And they push this content as a reinforcement to the 4-day or extended module training. We just completed our last training with the extended training pack cohort. We have 30 teachers who have gone through each of the modules. And as Charlotte mentioned, you can use the modules in any order you'd like. So we actually started with pedagogy in June. Then we did curriculum and planning in November, child protection, well-being, and inclusion in January. And we just wrapped up with teachers' role and well-being last week. So there was about 3 to 5 months between each training workshop, and part of the reason for this was we wanted to be mindful of the teachers' time in taking them out of their classroom. So 2 of the training workshops happened during their term break, and 2 of the training workshops happened during our term break from Teachers College Columbia University to accommodate the travel time for us. But we know that there's a great need in Kakuma for teachers to receive training, so we also had 3 cohorts of 102 teachers, around 30 to 35 teachers per cohort, who went through the introductory training pack, so the 4-day training. But both of these training tracks received complementary peer coaching and mobile mentoring. You can see this visual timeline. Again, if you have specific questions about the peer coaching or the mobile mentoring, I'll be happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but I want to be mindful of time to talk about some contextualization takeaways. So I think the biggest one for the Teachers for Teachers team, as we're not based locally in Kakuma, is that it is critical that we identify and collaborate with partners on the ground. I mentioned LWF. They help us logistically with transportation, picking the venue, as well as facilitating the sessions. Of course, visiting teachers in their classrooms is critical to see firsthand the needs, the challenges that teachers are facing. And this is especially true in Kakuma when you see teachers with classrooms of up to 200 students or more. You know that the grouping strategies in the training pack may have to be slightly adapted to adjust to the reality that they're facing. Again, familiarizing yourself with the national curriculum and education system is really helpful in terms of language. For example, in the curriculum and planning training, language such as schemes of work and lesson plans may mean different things in different contexts. In Kakuma, a scheme of work takes place per term and lesson planning takes place per week. So knowing that type of language helps make the training even more relevant. And of course, reflect, adapt, every day after training, coming back and thinking through what the teachers have said. So I'm mindful of time. I just want to highlight one more key takeaway, specifically incorporating opportunities throughout the training for feedback and input from the teachers. We've had the privilege of going back and forth from Kakuma for about 10 months, and we've been very mindful to hold focus group discussions, as well as give training workshop evaluations to the teachers so that we're continuously adjusting the training to meet their needs. Additionally, through the teacher learning circles, we get feedback from the teachers on the main topics that they discuss, so then we can follow up every time we get to go back to Kakuma to facilitate another training. Finally, our biggest limitation is our limited time in Kakuma. It's really, it can be frustrating at times to not be able to follow up with all of the very urgent needs that the teachers have and training needs for going back and forth. But we're making it work for this model, of course, and that's why building capacity of the teachers themselves and local staff is so important. I'm not going to go into the two other limitations, but if anyone has any questions, of course, feel free to put it in the chat box or ask during the Q&A. And I will pass on over to Kathleen again to talk about South Sudan.
Hi. We have everyone make sure to mute their microphones. Okay. I'll try to start and hopefully. Emmeline, can you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. Okay, great. So this is Kathleen again. Danny, can you switch over control of the PowerPoint?
Oh, yes, sorry, I just did. Let me.
Oh, there it goes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. So in January, I was hired by NRC to go to South Sudan and help them to contextualize the TIC materials for that setting. So I was hired by an interagency effort led by NRC, but it's also in coordination with Save the Children, FCA, and Intersos. And basically what they wanted me to do was to come in and contextualize the materials to South Sudan and then also conduct a TOT so that their staff could be trained and then move forward and implement the materials in the field themselves. So just a little background about South Sudan. The current conflict started in 2013 and is ongoing. 3 million people have been affected by the conflict. There are over 1.9 million IDPs, and 50% of the IDPs are school-age children that live in either IDP camps or urban areas. And there has also been a famine since 2013, so about 4.8 million people have been affected by this famine, and a lot of children are malnourished as a result. So there are various challenges that teachers face in South Sudan that are similar to the other challenges that we discussed for Iraq and Kenya, so I'm going to move forward and skip those. Like I said earlier, I conducted an interagency training of trainers for NRC, FDA, InterSOS, and Save the Children staff. I acted as the international consultant and led the contextualization process of the curriculum, and also was the main facilitator for the training, but we also hired a national co-facilitator from INEE Teacher Training College, which is a teacher training institution in southern South Sudan. So he kind of helped me to contextualize materials, also helped me to facilitate training, and then after the training helped me to make edits to the materials. And then the training was also attended by local head teachers who were able to really give us good insight into the reality skills. So some of the outputs that I accomplished with the training of like a training pack. I created a contextualization and implementation guide so that they could create their own teacher training strategies for each NGO and plan how they would implement the training moving forward. So it just got them to kind of think about all the practical steps they needed to take, which teachers they wanted to train, what locations, what materials they needed to buy for the training, what modules and topics they would focus on, any further contextualization needs that they had. They're just trying to help them to really think about the practical things they needed to do in order to make the training happen. And then the last thing I did was create a report on lessons learned. And I'll talk more about those lessons learned in just a minute. So for South Sudan contextualization, similar process to Iraq. I started off with a literature review. And then I sent out a staff questionnaire to the NGO workers. I was working remotely from the US, and so I didn't have a lot of access to the teachers themselves. So I mostly was interviewing NGO staff to get their opinions about the context and the different realities teachers are faced with. And then I also had them conduct teacher interviews. And like I said earlier, I was working with the national co-facilitator from INEE Teacher Training Institute. That institute, due to the conflict, had moved temporarily to Uganda, so he was also operating remotely, but we were able to work together through Skype and lots of emails to kind of get the materials ready for the training of trainers. And then we also brought in local experts, specifically the Child Protection Cluster, so that we could learn more about referral mechanisms and things there. And then at the end of the TOT, we gathered all of the feedback from the participants and incorporated those into the final training pack. And then each night at the end of training, I also had a debrief with some of the NRC education staff, and they were able to give some really critical feedback. So after contextualization, at the end of the training of trainers, we had a session, kind of like a workshop, where each NGO sat down and kind of made a plan for how they would implement the training. And I won't go into too much detail for this part, but I just want to give you a broad overview of all the different ways that the training can be adapted and implemented. There's a lot of flexibility with this training pack, so hopefully this will give you an idea of how it can be used. But InterSOS decided to use the training pack, the initial introductory training pack, which is a 4-day training. They decided to do that with untrained teachers for 4 weeks during the summer before school started. And then once school started, they would train all teachers using the full training pack. So they decided that they would do 1 module for every 2 months throughout the year, and then provide ongoing support through TLCs, a refresher training, and mentoring. And they used their own education staff to facilitate this. FCA decided that they would do training based on topics, so they selected key topics that were relevant for their teachers, and they basically pulled those sessions from the extended training pack and contextualized it in a way that was relevant for their teachers. And they delivered, they're planning to deliver 2 days of training for each topic for 4 months. So it will be 8 days total, but they wanted to spread it out over 4 months so that teachers weren't oversaturated with information. A lot of times in teacher trainings, we do kind of a one-off training and we give teachers so much information, but then it's difficult for them to implement any of it because it's so much at once and they haven't had a chance to practice anything. So spreading it out was them trying to make teachers have a little bit more time to practice in between topics. And then also TLCs would provide ongoing support in between each of those trainings, and they would also provide support through classroom observations. NRC, after the TOT, they took the materials and did a little bit more contextualization, and they did a 5-day pilot of the materials to field test them. And then they plan to do a 5-day training before school started this year using the introductory training pack. A refresher training 1 to 3 times throughout the year as needed. And that would just be based on whatever topics they thought were most relevant, and they would pull those out of the extended training pack again. And they also plan to support teachers with TLCs and mentoring. And the last one is Save the Children. So they will be using the extended training pack for 6 months, and they're going to be using 1 module for every 1.5 months, and use TLCs and mentoring. So that just gives you a really brief overview of each of the different plans that they have for implementation. In terms of lessons learned, after this training of trainers, we're kind of able to learn a lot about what that training of trainers looks like and how it could be better facilitated. In the future, we're going to be doing another training of trainers in East Africa and then potentially the Middle East. So we learned a lot about the TOT process from this TOT experience in South Sudan. So we hope to kind of we hope to kind of standardize the materials for the TOT process moving forward so that we can share them more widely. We also identified that there's a need for TLC and mentoring materials, which is something that the working group is working on creating. Also, there is a request for M&E tools and an M&E framework. And also, we were able to gather recommendations for a version 2 of the training pack. So we have a current training pack, and obviously it's being used in lots of places around the world, and we're gathering feedback from it. And so this would be a way for us, this was one way for us to gather more feedback about the current pack and how we can improve it moving forward. So that's it for me. So I'm going to pass it back to Charlotte.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you both so much. I'm really conscious that we're running out of time, and with the technical difficulties when we began, we're now short of time for the Q&A. I think we'd be happy to stay on if colleagues can stay on, and if you do need to jump off, please do send your questions in the chat box, and then we can follow up with you afterwards. Before we do move to the Q&A, though, just a few quick final things from me. So as Kathleen mentioned, we're trying to learn as much as possible from this process. It was really exciting to get the materials up and running and launched and out there, and now we want to learn as much from them as we can. And I'm just conscious that people are using these in a whole host of ways in different contexts. So we'd love to hear from you. So please do fill in the feedback form that's available on the INEE website if you are using the materials in any way, or send feedback directly to us at the address, the TPD address at INEE. And really, we'd love to hear from you and find out more about how you are using the materials. Also, a quick thing, future open source resources that will be available from the TIC on the INEE website. As I mentioned, French and Arabic translations of the training pack will be available for use soon. The peer coaching pack that is being used in Kakuma at the moment will be available very soon too. It's just being finalized. And this is a 2 or 3 day training for teachers to really support them as they facilitate teacher learning circles and do peer classroom observations. So that will be available to help reinforce the training. And as Kathleen mentioned, we also have work streams around developing M&E tools and advocacy materials. So we look forward to sharing those with you very soon. And then this last thing that Kathleen mentioned around providing more implementation and contextualization support. So this webinar came about from requests after the initial webinar we did last year around the principles and the motivation behind this work, to have a more concrete look and practical look at implementation. But we realize the webinar is a brief introduction. So just so everyone's aware, we are going to be hosting versions of the webinar in Arabic and French later on in the year, and with panelists speaking to their experience working with those materials in those contexts. So do look out for those invitations. As Kathleen mentioned, we are also developing this implementation and contextualization workshop toolkit, if you like, a bit like drawing on the work that Kathleen did in South Sudan. And so that will be available, and that's really to be able to provide tools that so colleagues can come together in the context and spend, it's going to be a 5-day workshop, likely a 5-day workshop. Colleagues can come together, become familiar with the materials and contextualize them together. So that's something else to look out for. And we are going to be piloting this and using this in East Africa and the Middle East in coming months. So again, if you're interested in that work, please do reach out to us and get in touch. And the working group are keen to support in any way that they can. So just some kind of key things to be aware of as this work moves forward. And I think just to say, I think it's been really exciting, and the lessons that learned that Danny and Kathleen shared around kind of this interagency approach and the different way that colleagues are using this. And so with that in mind, we would like to hand over to questions and reflections from colleagues on the webinar, conscious that many of you may have to run off to meetings now. But if you can stay on the line, we'd be happy to take questions, but we'd also love to hear your own lessons learned from using the materials yourselves in your context. So please do feel free to send through any questions in the chat box, or to take yourself off mute and ask any questions to the panelists. But we're also joined by other TIC members on the webinar, so I'm sure they'd be happy to jump in with answers too. So I know we're at the hour, but if you do want to ask a question, please do go ahead.
So there was one question on the chat. What does training look like for the education officers on how to do classroom observations, how to mentor, and how to give teacher feedback? So I can go ahead and answer that one. So with the IRC, we have developed our own classroom observation training, mentor training, and that all includes information about how to give teachers feedback. So for the classroom observation training, typically we, go through the tool and go through each indicator and what to look for when you're scoring each indicator. And I usually use classroom videos to practice filling out the tool. And then it's really great to do a classroom observation, like to do a field visit and do a classroom observation together, and then debrief afterwards and go back and kind of norm the scores and make sure everyone's on the same page. So I usually do that like through 2 to 3 observations. And then when I send officers into the field to do observations, I usually send them in pairs for the first couple of observations so that they can have more practice, and then they can norm the scores together at the end. And then after a couple times, when they feel comfortable, then they start doing the observations by themselves. In terms of mentoring, we kind of talk about the differences between being a mentor versus a supervisor. So how to come in and give constructive feedback, but not, I guess, in any way, like the feedback is not going to hurt the teacher in any way. It's not going to make them lose their job or anything like that. So how to give constructive feedback and how to have a conversation at the end of the observation so that the teacher is being asked to reflect on their own teaching practices, and it's not just the mentor telling them what they could improve on, but it's the teacher figuring that out for themselves. That's a lot of the approach that we're using for the mentoring materials that Danny is helping to create with the TIC. So that's just like a brief overview of what we did with IRC. But it was about a 3-day training total for that, but it can be condensed to 2 days, which I think is how long the TIC materials will be.
Yeah, and I see a few questions about mentoring. And I see also that Mary Mendenhall is on the line, as well as Charlotte, who created the mentoring curriculum and content. So please feel free to jump in at any point. But the first question was about learning more about mentoring. Did it go well? Did I have to combine it, or did you combine it with face-to-face mentoring? What messaging content was prioritized? For which purpose and which frequency? So the mentoring overall has gone really well. We grouped teachers within their training cohorts. So as I spoke about, we have one training cohort who are going through a long-term training, the extended modular pack. And then we have 3 cohorts who have gone through the short-term training, the introductory training pack. So groups of 4 to 5 teachers from each training cohort are matched with a global mentor who is a teacher or an education professional outside of Kakuma. We have global mentors in Kenya, South Africa, New York, UK, really all over. And they speak on average 1 to 3 times per week. And teachers are able to ask questions in real time for challenges they may be facing in their classroom. And the global mentors are also given a mentoring curriculum that has text-ready content, so not quite as short as a tweet, but pretty short messages that are mirrored to the training to reinforce some of the learning. We did realize that one of the challenges we faced was the time difference between the teachers in Kakuma and the global mentors. So while there were real-time chats that were happening, sometimes there would be a day or a few days in between a response being, or a question being responded to. So we're thinking through different ways to improve that lag time. Some ideas actually that the teachers recently just had, we held a few focus groups with teachers in Kakuma last week about mentoring, was having set times to talk, as well as having casual conversations that come up every day, but really designating a specific time for even 15 to 30 minutes per week where you'll know you'll have that real-time conversation.
Yeah, shall I just to add that? No, not at all. Thanks for that. I think what the mobile mentoring layer, kind of as an extra layer of TPD, has been exciting in 2 ways. Because one, it's been around increasing that a layer of support for the teachers, so that creating a support network amongst the teachers in Kakuma, and then but also beyond that. But then also, we mentioned earlier, obviously, this idea about increasing support outside of the training room, and there's that notion of kind of nudging and prodding between trainings to try new strategies. And so the curriculum content that Danny mentioned, it's aligned with the competencies and the strategies covered with the training. So the messages will be a reminder to try different strategies for the teachers, and then they can have that, that reminder on the date and try something out and see how it goes and reflect on that with the mentor. So it's been exciting to try that out. Thanks so much for that, Danny. We also seen a question around the fact that different teachers will have different skills and needs, and how does the training cater for that. And I think it's worth saying that the training was very much designed for untrained or undertrained teachers, but also to serve as a refresher for teachers who may have received training. And so it really is catering for teachers who may not have had much experience at all in the classroom, or may have had a lot of classroom experience but not much training experience. And so hopefully it is accessible for teachers of different skill levels. But I think as well, the training is very much trying to model teaching practices around differentiation and so on. And so there are opportunities to support teachers in the group and to challenge other teachers in the group built into the training. So it's a great question, and hopefully the training does address that. But I also think that's part of the needs assessment and contextualization piece, where that becomes so important in making sure that the training is as relevant and appropriate as useful. So thank you so much for that question. And we've had a few questions around evaluating the impact of the materials and the different layers. So Danny and Kathleen, I wondered if you had any reflections on that at all. Danny, I know you've been doing a lot of the significant, most significant change work in Kenya, so I wondered if you just wanted to speak to that as well.
Yeah, that's great. This recent trip, I actually think my colleagues from Teachers for Teachers, Emily and Sophia, are also on the line. So please feel free to jump in whenever. We did a lot of pilot research using a technique called most significant change. We did an initial round of this in January, which is about halfway through the 10-month implementation timeline, where we asked teachers to reflect on the most significant change that they experienced through their participation in Teachers for Teachers. And since the Teachers for Teachers model incorporates the in-person training, the peer coaching, and the mobile mentoring, we're very eager to tease out the different impacts that could potentially be attributed to each of the components or the combination of all three components together. One of the biggest challenges that we've had in terms of evaluating the impact of Teachers for Teachers is that we have a lot of self-report data from the teachers themselves. So what our framework looks like is we have a pre and post-training questionnaire. The pre is given on the first day of the training, and the post-training questionnaire is given after the peer coaching and the mentoring have also concluded. We have training evaluations after each training workshop to get feedback from the teachers themselves. And we've been facilitating focus group discussions on the entire model as well as each specific component with teachers in each of our visits. But as I mentioned, one of our biggest limitations is we're not based in Kakuma, so being able to go and conduct classroom observations or have more time in the teacher schools is not something that's completely feasible. To address this issue, though, we are going to do a most significant change technique with teachers, students, or students of the teachers who have participated in Teachers for Teachers. We just piloted this with 3 groups of students last week, and we got some exciting feedback. We hope to expand that type of evaluation technique next month.
Thanks, Danny. And I think just to add to that, it's great questions around assessment and evaluation, and I think that's become a real focus for the Teachers in Crisis Context Working Group moving forward, is being able to provide more resources around that piece. So great questions, and we hope to be able to get back to you with more tools in the near future. Kathleen, did you have anything you wanted to add from the Iraq or South Sudan context?
I think the only other piece that we did differently that Danny didn't mention was a child satisfaction survey and an interview at the end of the teacher classroom observation. So a lot of times when we do observations, we go in and we just watch the teacher, but it's actually a lot more helpful sometimes to watch what the students are doing. So are the students paying attention, going to look at their work and seeing if they're actually doing it correctly, and then talking to the students after the observation and just getting their feedback on how they experience the lesson and what they learned. So I think that's a key piece that can be added to the evaluation piece for teachers. And then there were some questions about the resources for KRI, if they're open source or not. I can share the original version of the materials that I created in 2015. I have them in English and Arabic, so I can make those available, but also IRC this year has updated the materials to further contextualize them and to input feedback from the last year of use. And so I can reach out to IRC and see if they're willing to share those and hopefully be able to share them to the wider group. In terms of the materials I created for South Sudan, For implementation, I put links to those materials in this PowerPoint, and I think we're going to be able to post this PowerPoint after the presentation, so hopefully you guys can access them that way. Or you can also send us an email to the TPD at INEE site.org email address, and I can share them to you through email.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. And yeah, just to echo that, if anybody does have any further questions or keen to get any resources or be in touch with the working group in general, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm conscious of time, and I think we've covered a lot of the questions in the chat, but before we sign off, perhaps if anybody on the line wants to ask any more direct questions, please do feel free to unmute yourselves. Please do ask any questions, or if we've got anyone on the line who's already using the materials in perhaps a different way, please do feel free to, again, unmute and share your reflections and experiences. It would be great to hear from others if you have time.
Oh.